It's a very, very considerate response. If it's okay if I sit here? My wife says that when I die, she's going to put on my tombstone, it all started with Reagan. So I went out and I got the URL, it all started with Reagan.com.
Oh, good, good,
Which redirects to ThomHartmann.com. And the reason I bring that up is because before, in 1982, when Ronald Reagan stopped enforcing the Sherman Antitrust Act, you'll recall just a few years earlier, Jimmy Carter had finished busting up AT&T in the fine tradition of Teddy Roosevelt. An action that, oddly enough, had been started under the Nixon Justice Department, but was, carried forward over several administrations. But nonetheless, Reagan said, we're not going to do that anymore. It worked from 1881 until now, but we're not going to do that anymore. And so the consequence of that is that pretty much every industry you can think of is now dominated by functional monopolies, duopolies, triopolies, whatever you call them, but functional monopolies, a small handful of very large and powerful corporations that control everything from breakfast cereals to meats to grains to radio to television to newspapers to the media in general to literally fill in the blank, clothing, retailing, all those things that when I was a kid, growing up in the 50s and the 60s and the early 70s, you could go into any city in America. In fact, in 1968, I hitchhiked across the United States. I hitchhiked out to San Francisco from Lansing, Michigan, and spent the summer in San Francisco and in People's Park. Probably since this is being recorded, I should stop there. And you could tell as you went through a town where you were, because every town had locally owned businesses. They had locally owned stores, locally owned restaurants. They were often named after the town, locally owned banks, And perhaps most important, locally owned radio, whether it was commercial or non-commercial. And I say all that because I think that this ongoing, it's like a threshing machine. It's like this machine that just kind of mows across the landscape, chewing up everything in front of it, throwing out one homogenized product out the back. Industry after industry, this threshing machine has just wiped out so much of America. So much of what America was for almost 200 years, so much of the history and integrity and the strength, what made America America, what made the American middle class the American middle class. But it's also done it to the media. And that's why KPFK and other Pacifica stations and other kinds of community radio as well, and the occasional independently owned commercial stations, why they are so incredibly, vitally important. Yep. And so I want to thank KPFK for putting me on the air and really honor you all. I remember back in '97, I think it was, when my book Last Hours of Ancient Sunlight came out, and it was kind of a minor sensation. It was selling fairly well, and I came on and did, for a couple of years in a row, as I recall, came on and did fundraisers. You'd get the authors on to do the fundraisers and things. And the station's been on my radar screen for a long, long time, and it's always seemed like it's one of those voices standing up to Reaganomics and the whole, no! and it's something that we really, really deeply and fundamentally need. So, you mentioned the working people. One of the things that astounds me in American politics is how, well, I tell you the story of Carl. Carl had grown up in the 30s and in the Great Depression, and in the 40s went off to World War II, arrived in Japan just as right after the war ended. Came back to the United States, fell in love, got married, got a job in a steel mill. Actually, before that, he got the GI Bill. He wanted to be a history professor when he grew up. And so he started going to college. And 2 years into and he was getting a stipend to go to college. And he was getting college for free. And 2 years into that, his wife got pregnant, and so he dropped out and went to work in a steel mill. And you know, the bad news is that his working in that steel mill, he was working in this cloud of asbestos, which eventually killed him from mesothelioma. But the good news is that from there he moved to Lansing, and he got this job at Lansing Tool and Die, and for the next 40 years he had a good union job as a member of the machines union. And a good enough union job that he could raise me and my 3 younger brothers, and you know, put a couple of us through school, and provide for my mom, and pay off the house, and get a new car every 3 or 4 years, and we could take a 2-week vacation every year. And he had done all that being, you know, a college dropout. And that was the American dream. Carl was my dad, obviously. And he got it. My dad was a Republican. When my dad died about 4 years ago, I was there with him in his living room in the house that he owned that was paid off. And sitting there with my hand on his shoulder as he was drawing his last breaths. And over his shoulder was the kind of, you know, cork board with the pictures on it and stuff from the family and whatnot. And 2 of his favorite pictures were there. Me shaking hands with Pope John Paul II, and George W. Bush on the USS aircraft carrier, Abraham Lincoln declaring mission accomplished. My dad died a Republican. But, you know, he was getting increasingly disenchanted with the Republican Party. And I remember it was my dad who, I mean, he and I, when I was a kid, we used to watch Firing Line together, you know, William F. Buckley. We used to have these knockdown, drag-out political battles. He threw me out of the house when I was 16. And, I mean, we loved each other. It was how I learned how to debate with people and still love them when I'm done, or respect them at least, see the humanity in them. He took me to my first John Birch Society meeting. And when I was 13 years old, we went door to door for Barry Goldwater, because in my heart I knew he was right. 1964. But, and then 2 years later when I got arrested, you know, in a giant MSU SDS protest, he bailed me out of jail. And so my dad was always there for me. And growing up in that time, growing up in that era, growing up knowing that, one of the biggest challenges that I have is even explaining it to my own kids, you know, what it was like. Because nowadays you can, you know, fall out of an airplane from 100,000 feet, presumably with a parachute, and land in any city in America and look around, oh, there's an Olive Tree and a Holiday Inn and a McDonald's, and where am I? I have no idea. Because, you know, this handful of corporations owns the country.
That's right.
And the consequence of that is that, you know, little tool and die shops are gone, and the union jobs that were with them are gone. And, you know, this all started when Reagan stopped enforcing the Sherman Act in well, when he declared war on organized labor in 81, when he stopped enforcing the Sherman Act in 82, which led to the M&A frenzy and Michael Milken and all that kind of stuff, which is still going on. In fact, there was an interesting piece in the Financial Times a couple of weeks ago about how there's been a slight increase in mergers and acquisitions. This is a good thing, right? It's like, this means the economy is coming back. No, you idiots! It means that we're screwed. Anyway, so you know, I just wanted to share that a little perspective, a little bit of a story. I know that many of you have questions, and you know, we don't have a lot of time here. It's 25 after 2. I didn't prepare long remarks. I actually had a talk I was thinking about giving about the difference between liberal and conservative worldviews, but I do it so often on the radio, probably most of you could recite it. So, and if you can't, you will soon be able to. So, we could do Q&A if you'd like. If anybody has any questions, or if you just want to set me off on a rant. Right?
I think what we're doing here for purposes of recording is you're simply standing, and then I'm repeating the question or paraphrasing, and hopefully that will inspire people to be concise, and then Tom will answer.
And if I could just, before we start, just to ask as a favor, if you want to give a speech, you're welcome to call into the radio show. You know, and that sort of thing. But I'd appreciate it if you just had a question, if it was a concise question.
So I think the gentleman with the wristwatch back was the first hand up, so there you go, sir. To me, and then to Tom.
Okay, the question is, this acquisition of small businesses and the takeover of larger business over smaller business, which you kind of trace to Reagan's term in office. I have a daughter who lives in Sweden, a rather progressive country. She lives in a small city. The exact same thing has happened in Sweden, where basically the individual shops that existed, most of them are gone, and in their place come the chain outfits that operate, and you see that throughout much of Europe. You see in France a lot of the small French business.
Yeah.
So I don't know if it's necessarily a function of who was president in the United States or anywhere else.
Okay, you want to summarize that for the
Summarize that. What you spoke of, Tom, about the acquisition of small businesses by big businesses. The gentleman referenced his daughter who lives in Sweden and says basically the same thing has been happening there as well. And therefore, is this, I suppose, to summarize, more an effect of global economic trends rather than attributable to one president?
Yeah, in short form, yes. I gave a speech in Stockholm just maybe 8 months ago, and there's still a lot of local business, but you're right. And in Europe they call this neoliberalism, and it was arguably Milton Friedman, was promoting this stuff back in the 30s when people thought he was a crackpot, in the 40s and the 50s and the 60s. And Jimmy Carter started drinking that Kool-Aid the last 2 years of his administration a little bit. But it's been happening all over the country. Reagan put it on steroids, and no president since then here in the United States has pushed back against it. And much of Europe has been moving in that direction. And oddly enough, much of South America is moving in the other direction. They're actually starting to, in some of the countries, are starting to break up some of their monopolies. But this is that dynamic tension. The game Monopoly is a really, really instructive game. It was invented back in the just after the turn of the 20th century, early 1900s, and it was to demonstrate that if you play the game the way that it's being played now, that what you end up with is the game ends. Somebody ends up owning all the property. And then you say, okay, that's the winner, everybody else is the loser, the game's over. And at the time that it was put out, I'm forgetting the woman's name, Mary was her first name, the woman who came up with the idea of this game. The idea of it was to demonstrate the dangers of laissez-faire capitalism, the dangers of unregulated capitalism, and why we needed strong enforcement. I mean, this was just after Teddy Roosevelt had taken on Standard Oil, why we needed to be breaking up these monopolies. Because eventually you'd end up with just, in every industry, you'd end up with, one person owning it, and eventually that one person would own everything, and then game over. And frankly, I think that that's what's happening to our economy right now. I think that we are headed on a trajectory toward game over, toward capitalism consuming itself. I think Karl Marx's analysis of that was absolutely accurate. And the monopoly, my clock here. I didn't know it had sound effects. The monopoly metaphor is absolutely accurate. In fact, the book I'm writing right now, the opening chapter is about monopoly. And I think it's one of the most insidious things that we need to be aggressively pushing back against. And I've heard people say, well, can't we push back by doing economic boycotts, like don't shop at Walmart or don't buy things from McDonald's. That's buying into their game. That's trying to beat them at their own game, and you won't be able to do that. Particularly when they've put everybody else, all this competition, out of business, number one. And number two, this fellow I was actually talking with last night, he says, well, shouldn't we just vote with our dollars? Well, again, that's using their frame. I mean, their frame is whoever has the most dollars has the most votes. And no, we should be voting, we should be participating in the democratic process. We should be taking the damn thing over. We should be occupying, Congress, occupy the Democratic Party, occupy the Green Party, get out there, participate, and then let's get a president who will once again Or let's force the one that we have right now to start once again enforcing the Sherman Antitrust Act and start breaking up some of these big companies that are destroying not only this country, but as you say, all over the world.
We are going to shift to me handing the mic to you after one more round. I'm a little stuck here, so that's what we'll be doing. But for right now, let's go right here to this question. For the last time to me, you're so many questions. Linda first, you second, and Linda, go ahead.
Hi, welcome to Los Angeles again.
Thank you.
I follow you. I have TuneIn on my phone, TuneIn Radio, which spotlights KPFK, by the way. But also I follow you all around the country, and I noticed you've been in commercial media, commercial progressive media, and and I also see you on Free Speech TV, which is similar to KPFK but in video. So I would like to know, since media, mass media, is the vehicle and the funnel into the mind of the democratic actor, which is the people. What has been your experience in progressive media and in commercial media and in the rest of the media? What have you experienced in progressive commercial media, and what do you think of it, its future?
Thank you for asking the question. It's a good one. I started out in radio when I was a kid, when I was a teenager, and started at WITL, AM and FM, Lansing, Michigan, and a country western station. It was owned by three guys who literally started the station. This was in 1967, I think, and maybe 68. And at that time, the Fairness Doctrine was in effect, which meant that radio stations had to do community service. It didn't mean you had to read a PSA about the bake sale. It meant you had to provide news. It didn't mean that you had to balance Rush Limbaugh with Alan Berg, who was actually the #1 talk show host in America at that time. He was a liberal out of Colorado. It didn't mean that Alan Berg had to be balanced. It simply meant you had to have news. We had 5 people in the newsroom in this little station in Lansing, Michigan. It's a country western station. And I ended up working 7 years in that newsroom. If I had been seen having lunch with a salesperson, I would have been fired. That was, there was just this absolute firewall. CBS, ABC, NBC, they all lost money on their news divisions. They had bureaus all over the world because everybody in the business knew that the price of getting your license renewed every year was providing community service. So in commercial radio at that time, there was, between that firewall, literally I could say anything about anybody, and the salespeople couldn't come in screaming at me. And on the other hand, they couldn't come to me and say, hey, why don't you talk about the movie that our company owns, or whatever. So my experience with commercial radio pre-Reagan, he stopped enforcing the Fairness Doctrine in '87. Same year Limbaugh started. My experience in commercial radio then was actually a fairly good experience. It was local programming that was doing good local work, and there was also a revenue model. People could make a living doing it. There were also non-commercial stations, and NPR, I don't know if it had gotten started at that point or if it was just starting up, but whatever. Since then, I worked at Air America for a couple of years. They syndicated my show. It was kind of a tragedy in that there were people managing who were activists, not even good activists. There were people. It was badly managed. I'll just leave it at that. I don't want to pick on the dead. But it was also a brilliant idea when it started out, which was let's buy stations all around the country and then put progressive programming on. It was such a brilliant idea that Mitt Romney and Bain Capital did it, and they own these Clear Channel stations all over the country. I do have to say though, I did a morning show on the Clear Channel station in Portland for 2 years, KPFK, and nobody ever said a word to me about what to say on the air. So, but I think that the biggest problem isn't so much is it commercial or is it non-commercial or whatever. I think it's this consolidation that has happened, and vertical integration in the radio industry too, where increasingly we're seeing local radio stations owned by big corporations who produce their own programming, and so they just drive that programming down, and what it does is it blows out the possibility of local programming or independent nationally syndicated programming, which is what I do. And I will always defer to local programming. I think it's wonderful stuff. I used to do it myself. But in the movie industry, in the 1920s, 30s, and 40s, the movie studios owned the movie theaters, and they employed the stars. And Congress came in and said, this vertical integration is wrong. You can't do it. And they broke that up, and what that did is it produced this explosion of new movie studios and all kinds of new programming and new movie theaters and all kinds of innovation. It was a great thing, having big government, step in and do this. Same thing happened in television in the 60s. As I recall, the 60s might have been the early 70s. You had 3 networks that basically owned the programs that they created. They hired the talent, they owned the programs, they ran the programs on the stations that they owned. So it was this complete vertical integration, and there was no place for anything that was independent and very little place for anything that was local. And so again, Congress stepped in and said, no, you can't do that anymore, and they broke that. They said in primetime programming you have to have at least, I think it was 2 hours of independent programming. And the first person to create independent programming for television when that law passed was Mary Tyler Moore, and with MTM Enterprises, and she produced all this cool stuff. And then Stephen J. Cannell came along, and you had all the Magnum PI shows and all that stuff, and A-Team, and there was just this renaissance in television. Radio is the one of those 3 industries, or 3 media, that has not been touched like that, and is still highly vertically integrated. And I think that is probably the biggest challenge, and I frankly don't think that our politicians have the courage to do anything about it. But I think that for the good of the demos, of the populace, of all of us, that rule that was applied to both movies and to television should be applied to radio.
I want to ask a question. Being that propaganda is such a serious problem for our democracy, the question is about truth in advertising. You can't advertise a product. Bear aspirin can't say that it cures cancer. Is there any way?
It actually does.
I was afraid that was going to be a bad analogy.
It doesn't cure it, but there are good studies that show that if you take a little bit, you know that stuff.
Yeah. And of course you know the point I'm trying to make.
But I know your point.
Is there any way, do you think, that we could ever get that applied to political advertising? Of course you can't do it for speech, but the ads have to go through their own review boards and such inside whatever organization. Can there be some external organizations that you have to have proof of 2 points of any statements that you make or whatever?
No, is the short answer. And the reason why is multifaceted. First of all, if Bayer started running ads that said, to use your example, that said, we actually cure cancer rather than we just prevent it, or reduce the likelihood of it, and this is not a pitch for Bayer aspirin, then somebody who takes aspirin and gets cancer will have standing to go into court and sue Bayer, and hire a lawyer like Mike Papantonio and go in there and create some real financial pain. It would take a couple of years, or it could take a couple of years, but that's the process typically that people are held accountable, although there are laws about truth in advertising as well. I mean, it's possible that there could be a government intervention and prosecution. But all of that is a rather lengthy process. And when you're in a political campaign where the last 3 weeks is going to make all the difference, it's virtually impossible to say this ad is true, this ad isn't, number one. Number two, your truth might be different from the guy down the street's truth about what is on any particular issue. When does life begin, for example? If you wanted to have somebody arguing abortion. And number three, and I think probably the most important one, is that the Supreme Court over the years, and I strongly disagree with 1803 Marbury versus Madison, where the Supreme Court took on to itself the power to strike down laws as unconstitutional, which is a whole separate rant. But nonetheless, they have held that power since 1803. And so what the Constitution says prior to that was what we the people said. Now it's what the Supreme Court says. And the Supreme Court says that of all the forms of protected speech there are, political speech is the most protected. So the only solution that we have right now over the short term to this problem is at least knowing who's lying to us. And this was the Disclose Act that Nancy Pelosi got passed out of the House of Representatives 2.5 years ago, that was filibustered in the Senate by the Republicans and died, which required you know, how on a regular political ad, if you say, hi, you know, John Kerry ad at the very end, I'm John Kerry and I support this message, or I'm Barack Obama and I support this message. These ads that are from the Americans for Better Government, or whatever it might be, you know, would be, the CEO would have to come on and say, I'm Joe Blow, the president of Johnson & Johnson, and I paid for most of this ad, or something like that. And that disclosure would also have to be available on the internet, so we could know who is telling us these things. One of the more common things that's done, particularly on the Republican side, is they'll pick, in the primary process, they'll pick the Democratic candidates they want by attacking the good progressive Democrats and lifting up the machine Democrats or the corporatist Democrats. And that way, you know, whether the Republican wins or the Democrat wins, it almost doesn't matter. If we knew who was funding those things, it would be a better process. But frankly, I think the whole thing is broken. I think that, you know, Citizens United was a travesty. I wrote a book about this called Unequal Protection. It literally starts with that Marbury case, goes to the Dartmouth case in 1815, the first time a corporation was given standing before the Supreme Court, 1886, Santa Clara County versus Southern Pacific Railroad. You know, in the 80s and 70s and 80s, the Buckley versus Vallejo that basically said money is speech. First National Bank versus Bellotti that said that corporations are persons, and then Citizens United that pulled it all together and turned it into mass insanity. And we need to amend the Constitution. There's a, you know, David Cobb, who is kind of the spokesperson for MoveToAmend.org, is just doing yeoman's work. I encourage you to go to MoveToAmend.org, sign up, create a local chapter, create a local organization. When we lowered the voting age from 21 to 18, it was less than 7 months from the time that was dropped into Congress until it was passed into law, until it was ratified by the 3/4th state, however many states that is. It is possible to do it and do it fast if you get enough really seriously pissed off people in the country. And I think people are really, really upset about the fact that hundreds of billions of dollars, or hundreds of millions of dollars, excuse me, are being spent in our political process by people we don't even know, and they're, you know, they're hiding behind these things. So ultimately, if we were to amend the Constitution to say corporations are not persons and money is not speech, and we have to say both, if we did that, then we could legally pass campaign finance reform that would either limit the kind of things that you're talking about. We couldn't pass a truth in speech law because, like I said, one man's truth is another man's lie. But we could pass laws that limited it. Like in the UK, you can't spend more than $100,000 on a political campaign, period. That's why their campaigns run 6 weeks. We could pass laws that gave public financing. I mean, you know, last year there was 110,000 people who pay taxes. 110 million. If 110 million people put in $10 a year, that's $1.1 billion. Over a 4-year period, that's $5 billion. That's far more than was spent in the last presidential campaign. And, you know, and that's just $10 for every taxpayer in America. And if you've made that progressive, you know, so that it was, if your income was over $100,000, it became $30 or something like that. You know, you understand what I'm saying? But we can't do these things because this insane Supreme Court and this 5-4 decision, you know. So you know, the one thing, the thing that kept me going and pushing Obama through this election, as much as I hate drone strikes and I disagree with him on NDAA, and I can give you the long list, was the fact that there are 4 people on the Supreme Court who are over 70 years old, and 3 of those 4 are right-wing whack jobs, and so. I'm very glad, at least, that it's not going to be Mitt Romney picking our next 1 or 2 Supreme Court justices. So it's a possibility that Citizens United could be overturned, but if it's not, I think that we need to amend the Constitution, and we need to get on that right away, and everything else flows out of it.